gonna kill the sound here. Well, thanks for joining me. I told you guys I was gonna show you this book called Dirty Old Boston. I went to this book talk a couple years ago. This guy is a retired school teacher, Boston public school teacher, and he started out in the 1970s. Economy was bad, and he wasn't even an education major, so he started as a substitute school teacher in Boston, and he got to see a lot of different neighborhoods, and he saw how these neighborhoods changes in the last 40 years. So he started a Facebook project called Dirty Old Boston because he remembered that the city was at one point was a lot more old and physically old buildings, and so it's not dirty in any bad derogatory way, just that it was an old city at one point, and some of the buildings were like a lot of American cities in the 70s, 60s, 50s and 60s, 70s were more in disrepair. So he asked people to submit these pictures, and these are all just pictures that people submitted from the 1940s through the 1980s, because he said that book ended an era in Boston of the World War II. After the war, people started moving into suburbs, so it was more changes in the city after because up until after World War II, with all the immigrants that came to Boston, it was hard. It was the only place you could only afford to live in the neighborhoods in the city, and suburban lifestyle was not really developed yet. So, and then the 80s marked the beginning of the gentrification of the neighborhoods because of like he said, the Orange Line went in the south end, and it kind of made it more like a Tony neighborhood, more cosmopolitan, and so it brought a lot more influx of revitalization, a lot of more money, and more expensive, and consequently changes because of some of the long-time immigrants and things like that were moved out of their neighborhoods. There was an area called the West End, which was, I think, completely demolished after that because of some of the new buildings and maybe like the Orange Line that went in. It's pretty. It's amazing. It's actually literally amazing to watch. I actually went to his book talk, and he had a lot of slides he was showing, but it's sort of it's interesting to see. Well, he said that it's neither good nor bad, but back then he said most people stayed in the neighborhood they grew up in, or these ethnic neighborhoods. It was more like people stayed within their neighborhoods, but they really took care of them. They took a lot of pride in them, and also the cost of living back then was probably less per paycheck. You were paying nowadays in the city of Boston, people depending on your income, it's not uncommon for people to have to spend a good percentage of their income on just their housing. And he said back then that there wasn't as much new housing, and so but it wasn't great looking in some of these neighborhoods, but yet it wasn't as expensive per paycheck, percentage wise. So that's what happens when the modern era we live in now. So I think we're in the 1950s now. 1958 this is. Boston had a redevelopment association, and they were trying to redevelop part of the city. So that's part of how I got into this, because I was looking up some stuff at work, and I saw some photos online that correlated with some of the stuff I was looking at for for work, and I saw this guy's photography. In fact, there's a cool picture of the Mass Pike, like with no traffic on it. Looks like it was, you know, just put in, which be in the 60s, like 1964 is when the interchange went in Boston, I think, from the Mass Pike. Sorry if I'm not catching some of the print here, but just showing a little bit of an overview. So this is the seedier part of Boston back then. The south end all the way down to what is now the Theater District had these you know, more seedy areas back then, which are non-existent now, pretty much. At least not out in the open. Just kind of pictures of some of the residents. Different looking. That's Faneuil Hall, 1965. Of course, it couldn't have a book about Boston without one or two Kennedys in it. So then they started building these crazy looking modern forget the name of this architecture, and they had a lot of this in Boston and Cambridge in the 60s and 70s. Brutalist architecture, like concrete and just straight lines. That kind of took over some of the, you know, the old buildings they tore down. What's this say? Race day. Runners on the Dudley Street, Roxbury, Northeastern University. Couldn't have an old city without fires. Got some old street ball. This is in the South End, 1960s. South End, even up to, you know, since I've been here, it's changed. Become a lot more cosmopolitan as compared to like a really old looking neighborhood. South End. Washington Street's a main artery going through the South End. A little snow. Sorry, I gotta crack a window in here, man. It's getting hot. Once a building on bustling Commercial Street, most of Cornhill was demolished to make way for City Hall Plaza, but not without a fight. The slated demolition of the 1816 Sears Crescent building raised the ire of preservationists who protested the decision to bring yet another wrecking ball to town. The Sears buildings were saved, though everything across the street got axed. Downtown 1962, it looks completely different now. Most people, if you don't like bricks, then you won't like City Hall Plaza or bricks and concrete, because that's about all there is now. So what the West End, I think, so maybe the West End was what got tore down through that City Hall Plaza project, but you know, it was a big immigrant neighborhood, I've heard. I don't think I'll have time to go through all this, but so it's like a sugar factory. Domino Sugar Refinery along Fort Point Channel, South Boston, 1960. So, still in the 60s here. Fenway Park. Playboy Club in 1962. Closed in 1962. 1976. Interesting. So there's been different rock clubs over the years. You know, in Boston being a college town, a big music town with all the couple big music colleges, there's then you have the 1970s with well, the continuing playing out of the civil rights. The photo here of a demonstration. There was busing in Boston, so there was I think that's part of what they were demonstrating about, the forced busing of different people to different schools. And so there's the 70s, man. And look at, it's just, it's a different era. The 70s were like, it was like the beginning of a new modern time, but modern in a not in the same way that we live in now. And cities were kind of falling apart, I think, across the country in terms of the physical structures. That's why they were trying to, revitalize them, but okay, this is the first photo I saw about this on this guy's website. It says Mass Pike West, and I'm thinking that's like, it could be the entrance to the Pike off of Massachusetts Avenue by Newbury Street, but it's just like, maybe that's not exactly the one I saw, but it just looks empty. There's like 5 cars on the Pike. Good picture of 1970s America. Right there. You could come and live in the city cheap back then. Because, where it was at was all the nice houses that had gone up in the suburbs. This is my guess. Look at this guy. Look at those pants. Plaid pants, man. Part of the social demonstrations. Some hippies, still some hippies. Hippies are still in New England, in the woods these days, up in Vermont and New Hampshire. St. Patrick's Day. So, you know, it's like an old house. Old clapboard house. Little 70s love. Some bubbles. Some sunshine. I don't know, I think the 70s were a little bit of a transition period. Boston Garden. Broken out windows. Well, that could be any city. So this was, I believe this is the John Hancock, because what I heard is that their windows were popping out for some reason. It's the tallest building in Boston. Street hockey. Used to be a great view from the Hancock Observatory. They closed that after September 11th. Never reopened it. Well, it's the same Kennedy. I mean, you know, look at I'm not going to say Boston's not a working class city, but it doesn't feel like it anymore these days. Very academia, institutional economy. No, I mean, it never was probably a working class city, but it's still there was definitely that element. Yeah. It's fun to stay at the YMCA. Kind of a famous mayor, Kevin White, at the Boston Marathon finish line. Boston Bruins. Well, I don't know how much more I'm going to go through this. It's quite a big book, but it's pretty cool. So that Led Zeppelin album cover reminded me, it came out in 1975, it reminded me of this book because it shows, you know, that this period of transition from the 40s through the 80s. And then you get some of the young urban professionals coming in to the city, making 30,000. No, I don't know what to do. More expendable income. Larry Joe Bird, the Chief, Kevin McHale, Danny Ainge,